Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings to the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to Song of the Exposition, a 9-section long poem. In fact, we're going to point out that when you look at Leaves of Grass, this is actually the last, what has been sometimes referred to as the last vast poem that Whitman will ever write. Now, there's a lot of history to this poem. It's actually been called by any number of people a failure, and we're going to talk a little bit about maybe why that's the case. This is an introductory lecture, and then we'll do as we have done before and come back to take a look at the rest of the sections, one lecture at a time. This is a poem that was recited by Whitman the 7th of September 1871 for the 40th National Industrial Exposition. Think about that date of 1871. I mean, look at it. We're 5 years away from 1876, which is 100 years after 1776, and 1892 is the deathbed edition, and so you can kind of get a sense that we're 21 years away from the deathbed edition in 1871. Now, let's begin with a few assumptions here. Our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net down the left-hand side. That is to say, you've been working with our Talks with Walt playlist all the way from the very beginning. And for those of you who have stuck with us all the way to this point, as we've said in prior lectures, that's quite a Dante-like journey, no question, to go from that very first word of the deathbed editions, the word come, an invitation, and we've worked all the way up to and now to this place. We just finished with Song of the Broad Axe, and now we will turn to Song of the Exposition. Now, just to remind, our learning theory is that we're always looking to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. This poem, and I actually love this poem, this poem will play that same game of that tension that allows us in 303 to always say the new is the new. The N-E-W is the K-N-E-W. You know, it's like a student the other day was talking to me about early video games. He had seen an early video game, the Atari Pong game, where a little thing went back and forth across the street. He couldn't believe that anyone could have been excited or enamored, and yet it is true. If you do a study of video games, that was a huge deal back in its day. To that degree, the new for us always seems somehow so transcendent to the old, and yet everything comes around. And so our learning theory will play that game. We're always looking for information, that is to say, that we can use. Now, our annotative approach is to work with 3 levels, in which we try and answer 3 guiding questions. At level 1, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? And at level 3, how can I relate to that text in some way? Now, at level 1, we're asking simply summarizing what we're working with. At 2A, we're working with themes and messages. At 2B, we're going to talk about the rhetoric of the text, not what Whitman says, but how Whitman says it, literary techniques. At 3A, we're going to ask, how can I relate this information to other texts, other ideas, other information that I know? Obviously, we're playing that game as it relates specifically to Leaves of Grass and the texts we've already worked with. We love that line from T.S. Eliot's Bert Norton, "My words echo thus in your mind, but to what purpose? Disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves, I do not know. Other echoes inhabit the garden. Shall we follow? Quick," said the bird, find them, round the corner through the first gate into our first world. Shall we follow the deception of the thrush into our first world? These echoes, and again, we've made this argument. I don't think you can read T.S. Eliot without having a real good understanding of maybe America's greatest poet, Walt Whitman. We're going to always be trying to connect this information. And then finally at 3B, and most importantly because of our learning theory, and for those of you who purchased your own copy of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass, you're working through it, you're annotating it, high five to you. We're always asking, how can I relate to this information to myself personally? I mean, what can I gain from this? Now, we don't want to forget, as we are studying Song of the Exposition, what we call our Big Five. That is to say, we're always looking about a text and the ways in which it can relate to 5 major concepts. How does this text relate to epistemology, what you can know, as we have said in many lectures? You're either an absolutist epistemologically, I know I'm right and you're wrong, or you're a relativist, there is no truth, which seems to posit a truth and breaks down because of the performative contradiction. Or Whitman's encouragement epistemologically, the fallibilist position. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. And you'll see some of this. In fact, the word perhaps is going to get used very early in this poem for that very reason. Second of the big five, ontology, that is to say the study of being. Whitman is very interested, in this poem especially, very interested in that question. Who are you? Well, it is true you're a body, but you're also a mind. And beyond that, you're also a spirit or a psyche, right? Consciousness of some kind. And to that degree, how do all three of those work together? We're going to see some of this here. Of our big five, 3, 4 then go together. Psychology, the study of the individual mind, the motivations, the fears, the anxieties that motivate all of us. And then sociology, what motivates the group? And we're going to see that tension all the way through Leaves of Grass, as we've said. You see this tension between the individual versus the group. And which is more important? We're going to see this here. He'll talk about the average people, but he'll capitalize the word people. So we'll pay attention to the sociological dimensions. And then finally, and I think why Whitman wrote Leaves of Grass in the first place, because of his experience of the Civil War. I mean, think about your date here of 1871, and then think about the dates of the American Civil War. And the fact that Whitman himself was a nurse during that war. I think the question of theodicy, our last of our big five, that is to say, why must bad things happen? Why can't we live in a world where there are no bad things? Now, Whitman is sometimes accused of being just a blind optimist. He does say in a journal's piece that he likes to stand for the sunny side of life. Having said that, it is clear, and you'll see it in this poem, he isn't a blind optimist. I would say he's an intentional optimist. That is to say, he looks at all the terrible stuff, and instead of asking, why did this happen to me, or to us, to America, or to the world, he asks, why did it happen for me? What can I learn from the experience? So he will say something pretty profound about war, and the idea of war, and just getting rid of all of it. So we'll get there. Finally, as we've said in earlier lectures, in these intro lectures, I like to just remind us of where we are. And I talk about the 5 P's of Whitman, the 5 perspectives on Whitman. Because when people ask me about Walt Whitman, I'll often say, well, which one? Like, which of the 5 for sure? And there's way more than 5, guys. There's way more than 5. But I'm just emphasizing the 5. Whitman is person. He actually has a biography. So, for example, he wanted this poem to become very well known, so he wrote editorials for this poem. We'll get into it here in a second. It's kind of fascinating, pretending to be somebody else. He did this several times, this self-aggrandizing type of thing. Obviously, another P is Whitman is poet, no question. Is this, in fact, one of Whitman's stronger poems, or is, Harold Bloom and others have argued this is basically not worthy of even being included in discussions of Whitman? The third P is, for me, maybe the most important. Whitman is pedagogue. He started out as a teacher. I don't think he ever left the longing to be America's teacher. We're going to see this in this poem as well. Of course, Whitman as politician and his love of democracy especially, we're going to see that celebration here. This kind of thing where we see Whitman just celebrating how amazing America is will turn many postmodern readers of today off. They will say, come on, we've been over this ground before, this blind celebration. But you got to remember, for Whitman, it wasn't blind celebration. I mean, again, think of your dates, right? We're 5 years away from the 100-year centennial celebration of 1776 and the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Finally, and significantly, we got to think of Whitman as philosopher. He's always challenging us here. From everything from Socrates to Emerson and everything in between. We're going to see his referencing there. Now, I've already suggested to you that the best way for you to approach this kind of material is for you to get your own copy, read it on your own, annotate it on your own, and then let what we have to say here be a guide for you. Let's start, first of all, with some background information on this poem. We'll begin with Norton's, and then we're going to spend some time with a couple of other scholars, just to give you a sense of where scholars kind of place this. Here's Norton's. Composed in response to the invitation of the American Institute to read a poem at the opening of its 40th annual exhibition in New York City, September 7th, as we said, 1871. This piece was published in the same year as a booklet under the title, After All, Not to Create Only, which is one of the early lines of the poem, following its appearance in a dozen newspapers, including the Washington Daily Morning Chronicle, the New York Evening Post, the Springfield Republican, on the occasion of its presentation at the exhibition. In fact, Whitman did his best, just to continue with Norton, to publicize the event, furnishing copy himself and later defending the poem anonymously against a prevailing hostile press. One editorial from the New York Globe of September 7th, 1871 boasted of the poet's foreign reputation with details which Whitman himself must have supplied if indeed he did not, if he indeed were not the actual author. The poem appeared under its first title at the end of the 1872 Leaves of Grass, and in the Two Rivulets of 1876 under its present title, Song of the Exposition, prefaced by an editorial. For the final 1881 text, the poem was improved by the addition of the opening 3 lines and the deletion of some 20 lines, but it remains, Norton now is going to get to the negative side of this, but it remains one of Walt Whitman's comparative failures because it does not surmount its own rhetoric. We'll debate whether that is in fact true. The theme was valid and peculiarly the poet's own in its insistence upon exalting the present and the real, quote unquote, and teaching, quote, the average man the glory of his daily walk and trade, end quote. But the stridency of tone and the bathos of some of the phrasing were painfully unapparent to the poet. Karen Wolfe has said it this way. The poem written for the 40th National Industrial Exposition of the American Institute, recited in New York by Whitman, as we said, September 1871. She says, Whitman was solicited. The Institute offered him $100 payment and traveling expenses and guaranteed publication in the Metropolitan Press, end quote. Whitman accepted the invitation. 4 days later, the poem was reprinted in 12 newspapers. Several editorials appeared on the day or soon after the reading. As was his tendency, Whitman probably authored several of them. The New York Tribune published excerpts, and soon after a parody by Bayard Taylor. However, critical attention, she goes on to say, has given this poem secondary place. I'd like to turn to David S. Reynolds' classic, Walt Whitman's America, A Cultural Biography. He has a really good paragraph that I'll share with you about this poem. On August 1st, 1871, the Board of Managers of the American Institute offered Whitman $100 plus travel and lodging to come to New York and deliver a poem for its 40th National Industrial Exposition. Within 3 days, Whitman accepted. His poetry reading on September 7th was an important public event covered in the New York papers. Biographers have tended to downplay the performance, characterizing it as poorly executed and generally lambasted. It is true that 2 New York papers, the Times and the World, said that Whitman's restrained delivery prevented his being heard in the noisy exposition room, except by those in the first few rows. But overall, the event was a public coup for Whitman, in both the short and the long run. The commercial advertiser emphasized that national poet was greeted by long, loud applause. The Evening Post called Whitman a good elocutionist, and in a piece titled Our Great Poet, the Globe pointed out England's love of Whitman, asking, what other American poet has been honored like this? The managers of the Institute were delighted, for on September 11th, they sent him an official note thanking him for his, quote, magnificent original poem, capital P, end quote. The poem was printed in no fewer than a dozen newspapers, and it would remain a key reference point for capitalist-leaning advocates of Whitman. And now just to finish, where will we head in regards to this? Well, no question, this is going to be a poem about industrial civilization, right? And elevating what he will call the average man, the people themselves. So we want to pay attention to that. Allen called this in Solitary Singer, however, a pathetic episode. Unfortunate in every respect, end quote. Again, we're going to debate this. We'll come back, however, to the same theme. We're going to see it in A Song of Occupations, a previous poem, but published later. Many have asked the question, why did Whitman not just put all of his poems in chronological order? Like, for example, Song of Occupations is coming later, two poems later now in Leaves of Grass, but was written much earlier. Like, why did he play that game? And there's a lot of answers to that question by Whitman scholars. One of the interesting things to do is to try to put all of Whitman's poems in chronology. The only problem with that is that he worked on poems again and again and again, and so it's really hard often to say, as we were pointing out even about this, it's really hard to say what is the what's the actual starting date, ending date of certain poems. But we are going to see it. We're going to see it in the Song of the Universal later, as well as in Passage to India. So we're going to see this kind of theme. And we've already seen the celebration of where I Hear America Singing is probably our best exemplar so far from the inscriptions section, right? Here we're going to meet the muse. He's going to say, installed within the kitchen where we're going to see in section 3. That'll be fun. We're going to be back to our catalog, so write that one down to show the diversity of his day. We're going to see this cataloging, as we have seen. Some love it, some hate it. I'll leave it up to you. He definitely wants to show the break, can we say it that way, from the old world to the new world. And of course, there's always this tension in Lysigrass, as we've said. Old versus new, the new is the new, the N-E-W is the K-N-E-W. We're going to play that game again. Now we want to pay attention to section 7, so write that down when we get there. Remember, Whitman, as we've already said, Whitman was a nurse during the Civil War. He saw the horrors of the war, right? That's why he's not, I argue, that's why he's not a blind optimist. He saw stuff. And he's going to say, away with themes of war. He's going to say, away with war itself. I think Whitman was always in tension, especially with Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil's going to get mentioned, as will Dante, but Virgil's going to get mentioned in this poem. I think this is one of Whitman's attempts later in his life to respond to Virgil and the idea of the exaltation of war and the song of war and all of that. Obviously, he's responding to Homer's Iliad as well. And by the way, of course, we've given full lectures at learnstrong.net over all the lines of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, and I think a whole lot of that is standing behind this poem. We'll maybe try and point this out. This, finally, is a poem celebrating post-war America, the new industrial revolution that is, in fact, happening right in front of him. And as we said, it's the last truly large poem that he ever wrote. Now, I think it's important that we point out that this was a poem Whitman wrote to read aloud. So, while several of these are songs, right, okay, we know that rarely he read them out loud or recited them or sang them out loud. This one he wrote specifically to be sung by himself, again, on the 7th of September, 1871. So we will now turn to passage number 1, section number 1, and we will enjoy ourselves with the first rhetorical question, what's up with the parentheses? Thank you.